The elderly Shukichi and Tomi Hiroyama leave their youngest daughter, Kyoko, in Onomichi to visit their other grown-up children in Tokyo. Mild disappointment dogs the whole enterprise, as their presence is clearly considered burdensome. Only their widowed daughter-in-law Noriko shows genuine warmth and welcome. Returning home, Tomi falls ill and dies. The family expresses regret, but only Noriko and Kyoko show more than superficial duty. Shukichi urges Noriko to remarry and move on while he contemplates his own lonely future. Tokyo Story's plot is simple. However, explaining Tokyo Story is like trying to have the last word on Citizen Kane. Its director Ozu Yasujiro has been considered both modernist and traditionalist, his work Zen-like while wryly urbane, his themes specific to their context yet universal. Ozu's films were not seen outside of Japan until after his death in 1963, because domestic critics considered that the West couldn't possibly appreciate anything so truly Japanese. Though universal acclaim met their international release, what strikes the first-time viewer is the unfamiliarity of Ozu's technique. Its antithesis to Hollywood style prompted David Bordwell to outline a formalist analysis that links Ozu's stylistic, self-imposed constraints to the rigid codes of Japanese poetic tradition. Additionally, Western analysis of Ozu's work is dominated by identification of his apparent Zen aesthetic, characterized in 1972 by Marvin Zeeman as the immediate and therefore inexpressible individual experience whose aim is inner enlightenment, essentially a mastery of technique presented as simplicity, harmonizing form and content without irrelevant details. This approach describes Tokyo Story well, but so does Mark Cousins' description of Ozu's films as classical, as the term is applied to European art. Though different in culture, the appreciative outcome is the same. Form and subject are harmoniously balanced. Thus, we could conclude that Ozu's mature films are simultaneously radical in their deviation from relatively recently established cinematic tradition, while conservative in general aesthetic. Seasonal moods are said to be central Zen tenets. Most closely cited in reference to Ozu is Mono no Aware, a melancholic autumnal awareness of impermanence. His films are characteristically concerned with stillness and contemplation, and his composition compares to classical Japanese art. Conversely, this stillness has led some critics to note similarities with European near-contemporaries such as Michelangelo Antonioni. The stylistic similarities may be superficial, but as far as cinematic aesthetics go, to label Ozu as uniquely Japanese is arguably reductive. Similarly, while his titles have an air of haiku, e.g. an autumn afternoon, early summer, equinox flower, the Japanese critic Hasumi Shigeko questions the Orientalist stereotyping, noting that the seasonal titles divert attention from the characteristic weather in the Ozu films, a dry heat more reminiscent of Californian Hollywood than subtropical Japan. A typical Ozu scene usually disrupts character stillness with a persistent waving of fans. David Dresser convincingly argues that Tokyo Story is paradoxically both insular and immensely universal. Is it about the breakup of the traditional Japanese family in the light of post-war changes? Or is it about the inevitabilities of life, children leaving their aging parents behind? Uniqueness of style and universality of theme both suggest why Ozu's films, and Tokyo Story in particular, hold such international acclaim and affection. Central to the emotional weight of Tokyo Story are the performances of Ryu Chishu and Hara Setsuko as Shukichi and Noriko, respectively. Ryu recalled endless retakes as Ozu harmonized even the smallest movement by actors within his compositions, but it is these two performers upon whom Ozu's calm cinematic rhythms depend for the full dramatic effect of both Tokyo Story and Ozu's other masterpiece, Late Spring. For example, Ryu utilizes a non-verbal purring noise, to express a huge array of complex emotion and meaning, whilst fanning the ailing Tomi, his calm assurance that she will soon recover is belied by a look of awful panic that briefly clouds his face. Later, he conveys the full devastation of Shukichi's loss when told Tomi will be dead by sunrise through the barest of physical movement. Matching the complexity of Ryu's minimalistic purr is the much-discussed Hara smile. This seems to convey everything from unguarded joy to a polite veneer masking devastation, disgust, or fury. When Noriko brings her parents-in-law home, she pops to her neighbour to borrow sake. She returns to find the Hirayamas admiring a photograph of her dead husband. Her smile rises in polite response, but realization that she also needs to borrow cups gives her reason to momentarily excuse herself. Their backs turned, the smile lightly crumples. It is the gentlest of scenes in this unwaveringly gentle film that transcends context, culture, formalist debate, and ideology. When Noriko receives news of Tomi's critical illness over the phone, at last she has a moment alone to let the public face drop. Her reply to Kyoko's blunt, "Isn't life disappointing?" is a beaming Beckettian, "Yes, it is." In this, the film's most famous exchange, every possible emotional interpretation can be found. The crystallization of Ozu's cinema in 2 lines of dialogue. A particularly noted Ozu technique is the pillow shot, not a term used by Ozu himself, but a way of defining his singular method of moving from scene to scene. Breaking with conventional dissolves or establishing shots, Ozu generally offers a cluster of exterior views using straight cuts between key scenes. Debate clusters around whether these provide the same function as a theatrical curtain, as a brief respite from the action of scenes, or an embodiment of Zen aesthetics. Interpretation can run wild, but it is worth noting that in Tokyo Story these shots often suggest thematic links to the characters' living circumstances, and by extension, personalities. Onomichi, and thus the Hirayama elders, is signified by gently chugging tugboats, temples, and open landscapes. Conversely, Ozu largely ignores any Tokyo landmarks except for a few cursory tourist shots on the Hirayama's bus ride, preferring images of smoke-spurting chimneys, suggestive of their children's urban lives and personalities. Noriko lives in the same city, but Ozu signifies her key scenes with images of washing, purity or duty perhaps. These sequences are generally considered to operate outside of the narrative, which is what differentiates them from straightforward establishing shots. But occasionally, overinterpretation misses the point when Ozu actually is giving us an establishing shot. The Hirayama's unanticipated stopover at Osaka is signified by Osaka Castle, for example. Tokyo Story is typical of Ozu's narrative structure, which deliberately omits the events one would anticipate as the most dramatic. Thus, the most seemingly substantial scene occurs off-screen, the collapse and illness of Tomi. Counterintuitively, we are instead shown Keizo, a son mentioned but until here unseen, discussing the incident with a work colleague. This approach asks the audience to fill in the gaps, trusting the spectator to do some dramatic work and respect the character's dignity. It also maintains the consistently moderate pace of the film and mirrors the realities of our participation in the action. As in life, we hear of crucial events related second-hand. Instead, Ozu's scenes often commence with an empty space into which characters enter. He then either refrains from cutting for several seconds after characters exit or lingers on them after conversation has ended. Thus the silences and empty moments become the lyrical points of signified meaning far more than the deliberately understated dialogue. Typically, interiors are largely shot from an unusually low camera height of 2 feet, just below head height when the characters adopt the traditional kneeling position for socializing. More extraordinary is Ozu's unique approach to cinematic space. Almost all filmmakers obey the 180-degree rule, where an invisible line is never crossed for fear of breaking the directional continuity. Ozu operates within a 360-degree space, with the result that characters suddenly appear to be facing screen left, when in the previous shot they had faced screen right. An example of this can be seen when Keizo approaches his office late in the film. He is shot outside, entering a door screen right, but the following shot shows him enter the room also from screen right, not the customary left. He appears to have turned back on himself. This would normally be considered cinematically wrong. While many viewers may not notice this oddity at all, what is unmistakable is the framing of dialogue. Ozu positions the spectator literally at alternate perspectives in a conversation, so actors often speak facing the camera. This again can be unsettling at first, but perhaps allows an unusual intimacy with the characters. Conversely, Ozu never milks emotion through an overemphasizing close-up, instead typically holding fast to the medium or even long shot. His camera may loiter for longer than comfortable, but never cheats by intruding on heightened emotion, evoking perhaps a sense of polite awkwardness. While the overall theme is certainly accessible, some context does prove useful in engaging with Tokyo Story. As with all of Ozu's mature films, it is an example of the shomingeki genre. This typically focuses on the lives of the contemporary Japanese middle class, though logically its characters, most clearly the war widow Noriko, are still reeling from post-war defeat, devastation and humiliation. 1953 saw the end of a period of Allied occupation and cinema censorship. Thus, the intergeneration fissure between the traditions of the elders and the westernized attitudes of the younger generation takes on a far more dynamic resonance than might at first appear. Notable, for instance, when Shukichi's friend Hattori complains about his young lodger's attitude and addiction to pinball. Subsequently, whilst out drinking, an off-screen, very Western big band tune diegetically intrudes on the elders' reflections of their past. In his critical study, Noriko Smiling, Adam Mars-Jones takes Ozu critics to task for extreme readings. The history of the film's reception in the West has been a tug-of-war between the Zen traditionalists, with Paul Schrader at their head, and neo-formalists like Kristen Thompson and her husband David Bordwell. For both camps, the films are apolitical, indifferent to history, except as it impinges on family relations. Mars-Jones instead considers the context of a nation adjusting to the aftermath of being the losing side of a devastating war, and the recent replacement of a theocratic militarism by a democracy that no one had voted for, as vital in reading Ozu. However approached, Tokyo Story boasts dozens of beautiful and striking moments. Space allows 3 examples. The heads of the passengers gently bobbing about in comical unison during the Hirayama's bus tour is a droll sight gag straight out of a Harold Lloyd film. In contrast, as the couple prepare to leave Tokyo, gently joking that they are homeless, Ozu allows his camera to perform its rarest of functions in his films. It moves. A brief tracking shot reveals them sat isolated on the grass and ends with a second following them up the road. Their remoteness from their disappointing family and the loss this implies is severe. Lastly, while fondly watching her grandchild, Tomi shifts from doting to sudden awareness of her mortality. The boy is oblivious to this moment of terrified insight and blithely picks flowers. There are many scenes in this beautiful film that suggest not so much a Zen-like wisdom nor an approach to cinema art that is predominantly Japanese or formalistically different. It is universal and in touch with human frailty. There is more, of course. There is no last word on Tokyo Story.